Hello class, it's me, Katie Garrison again. I'm covering for Ken on this new chapter for learning. So actually before I start, I'm going to just say, recall that a major theme in developmental psychology is the dual influence of nature and nurture in shaping who we are. So nature represents our biological inheritance from our parents, such as genes, whereas nurture represents the environment we grow up in and how it molds us. So according to behaviorists such as Skinner and Watson, how the environment shapes us and molds us is what learning is all about. When we use the term learn, we usually think about learning skills and information in school. However, in psychology, learning is much broader. At the end of this chapter, you will have a different understanding of what it means to learn. So learning can be defined as an enduring change in behavior that occurs with experience. So it's a stable change in the state of the learner caused by experience. And so those are two important components, one that it happens through experience and another that it's a change in the state of the person. So learning is much more than just book learning. It can be conscious and deliberate or unconscious. So we are molded and shaped by our environment. For example, a person may have low self-esteem because he or she grew up in a hostile home environment with parents who constantly criticized him or her. In that case, this individual learned to have low self-esteem because of the environment that they grew up in. Similar, look at this dog here with the beer bottle. The dog has learned to take beer to his owner because his owner has molded that behavior with treats and affection. So those are both two different kinds of learning. But the important piece is that we are shaped by our environment and our experiences. The essence of learning involves acquiring new knowledge, skills, values, or behavior. So there are a couple different types of learning. First is that we learn by association. So we make an association between two events that occur in close sequence. For example, thunder and lightning occur close together in sequence, and so we learn to associate those two things together. Our minds naturally connect events that occur in close sequence. We learn that sticking a fork into an electrical outlet is accompanied by shock and pain, so we learn to avoid that behavior. We also learn that the smell of spices and baked apples remind us of the holidays, and so that's an association. And there's like so many in our lives, I'm sure you can think of examples in your own personal lives of connections that you've made between stimuli based on your own experiences. This type of associative learning is reflected in two types of conditioning we'll talk about today, the classical conditioning and then instrumental or operant conditioning. And this is from the behaviorism tradition that people are shaped by their environments. The next type of learning is observational learning. And so here the idea is that we learn from observing or watching other people. And so things like we learn how to dance or we learn how to ride a bike, these things, people don't necessarily tell us how to do these things. We learn by watching other people and imitating them. We also learn how to behave pro-socially by being good and giving back to others. And this is often modeled by role models like our parents or teachers. And so this kind of learning is observational learning, and we'll cover this also. Okay, so we'll start with a type of associative learning called classical conditioning. So classical conditioning was first really discovered named by this Russian psychologist named Ivan Pavlov. And he actually discovered it on accident. He never intended to even do psychological research. He was studying digestion in dogs in the early 1900s, and he accidentally discovered conditioning. So what Ivan Pavlov did was he placed a tube in a dog's mouth to collect saliva. And then he placed some meat powder in the dog's mouth, which naturally produced salivation. After a while, though, Pavlov noticed that the dog began to salivate prior to the meat powder. It was just the sound of the technician preparing the apparatus that signaled to the dog that the meat was coming. So the dog had formed an association between a stimulus that had no inherent food value, the sound of the apparatus, and one that did, the meat powder. So Ivan Pavlov designed an experiment to test this idea. And so in classical conditioning, there is some stimulus that evokes a natural reflective response. And so in this case, there's like the meat powder, or we'll just call it like dog food, and it evokes this salivating response in dogs. And so this is a natural response. Dogs don't need to learn this response. It just happens automatically and instinctively. And so the unconditioned stimulus is the stimulus that produces this natural response. It's called unconditioned because it doesn't require any learning or conditioning. So in this case, the unconditioned stimulus is the food. And the unconditioned response is the natural reflective response. And so in this case, it's the salivating. So these are terms that you'll need to remember in classical conditioning. So in classical conditioning, some neutral stimulus, and so this is a stimulus that has no inherent meaning to the learner. This neutral stimulus is paired with the unconditioned stimulus and eventually evokes a learned response. And so in Pavlov's case, he designed an experiment where he rang a bell every time he gave the dog food. So the bell and the food eventually got paired together, and the dog learned to associate those together. And then soon, just ringing the bell would make the dog salivate. And so the bell is the conditioned stimulus because it is the stimulus that the dog learns to associate with the response. And the conditioned response is still the salivation, except that now it's conditioned because he's learned to salivate in response to the bell, not the like natural stimulus of the food. Okay, so let's look at this a little bit more closely. So in classical conditioning, there is, it always begins with an unconditioned stimulus evoking an unconditioned response. And this is just totally natural. Like if you present a really loud noise and then someone startles, the loud noise is an unconditioned stimulus and the startle response is the unconditioned response. So the stimulus response pattern requires no learning, it just happens naturally. But then during classical conditioning, the unconditioned stimulus is paired repeatedly with a neutral stimulus, which is called the conditioned stimulus. And this is the learning period. And so this is called the training period when this unconditioned stimulus is repeatedly paired with the conditioned stimulus. Note that at the beginning of learning, the conditioned stimulus does not evoke a conditioned response. So in Pavlov's case, the bell does not evoke this salivating response. If you just went up to a dog and rang the bell, nothing would happen. And so there has to be this training period where the bell is repeatedly paired with the unconditioned stimulus. So the bell is paired with the food. You ring the bell, you give the dog food, they salivate. You ring the bell, give the dog food, they salivate over and over and over again. And then soon enough, you ring the bell and the dog salivates, even without the food. And once this happens, it is a conditioned response because this response has now been learned. It's not a natural response, but it's been learned through association. Okay, so I'm just gonna beat you guys over the head with this because these terminology can be kind of tricky, and so I'm just going to go through this example one more time. So before training, in the natural state of things, the presentation of the food produces salivation in dogs. So this is the unconditioned stimulus producing the unconditioned response. But then there's a training period where there's a repeated pairing of the conditioned and the unconditioned response. And of course, because the unconditioned response is there, it's going to produce this, the unconditioned stimulus is there, the food, it's going to produce the unconditioned response, which is the salivation. So you ring the bell with the food, and then the dog salivates. And just during the training period, you present the two stimuli together over and over again. And then eventually learning occurs, and when you ring the bell, it'll cause the dog to salivate. And so, I just want to point out that this type of learning happens so often in our lives that you probably don't even recognize it. So for example, you might see the logo of your favorite fast food restaurant and you might start salivating. So that logo is just an abstract image. That logo on its own shouldn't make you salivate, but because you've associated it with food so many times, you've become conditioned, and now the logo is a conditioned stimulus and your response to it is a conditioned response. Similarly, if you hear like a cop siren, you might experience fear or alertness because it might signal danger or an emergency. And so again, that the sound of the siren is the conditioned stimulus, and you've learned this conditioned response because maybe the sound of a siren has been repeatedly paired with some emergency or dangerous situation, either in movies or in real life. And so I'm sure if you think about it, you probably can see some of this associative learning a lot in your own life. Okay, so I'm about to end this recording, and so before you open the next one, I would like you to open the video link in the eCampus page that's called Pavlov's classical conditioning for a really great example of this kind of learning.